Warning, the following ZipRecruiter radio spot you are about to hear is going to be filled with F-words.
When you're hiring, we at ZipRecruiter know you can feel frustrated, forlorn even, like your efforts are futile, and you can spend a fortune trying to find fabulous people, only to get flooded with candidates who are just fine. Fortunately, ZipRecruiter figured out how to fix all that. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/zip. With ZipRecruiter, you can forget your frustrations because we find the right people for your roles fast, which is our absolute favorite F word. In fact, 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day.
Fantastic!
So, whether you need to hire 4, 40, or 400 people, get ready to meet first-rate talent. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/zip to try ZipRecruiter for free. Don't forget, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip. Finally, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip.
Someone took MH370, but who and why? In today's episode of Finding MH370, we're going to delve into the motivation and methodology of one potential culprit with someone who has a rare and compelling perspective. Recently retired CIA officer Sean Wiswesser, who spent decades studying and applying the lessons of espionage and spy tradecraft. That's all coming up right now. Hi, everybody. Jeff Wise back with you for another episode of Finding MH370, the podcast where we take a deep, detailed look at the full range of technical evidence with the help of some of the world's leading subject matter experts in order to solve aviation's greatest mystery. Today, I'm really excited to talk to someone whose expertise is unusually deep and unusually hard to get access to. The Central Intelligence Agency is obviously a rather tight-lipped organization as a rule, even if after the retired CIA officers are bound by strict rules about what they're allowed to say. So I feel really lucky to talk to Sean Wiswesser, who has a new book out. He's concerned about what he sees as a dangerous lack of awareness about the threats facing the United States and the democratic West. It's a concern that I share. He wants to speak out and try to raise awareness before it's too late. Before we get into the meat of it, a little housekeeping. If you'd like to get a free newsletter that goes out with each episode, head over to the show page at findingmh370.com, where you'll also find an archive of past shows. And if you want to support the show, you can sign up for a paid membership there. You can also contribute with a paid membership here on YouTube. Going forward, I'm going to be adding exclusive content for members as a way to show my thanks and give something back to those who support I'm so grateful for. So keep an eye out for that. Okay, back to Sean Wiswesser. I want to be clear up front. I'm not talking to Sean about what the CIA thinks happened to MH370. That is not his bailiwick. Frankly, I don't think the U.S. intelligence community has any idea what happened. What we're going to talk about is the strategic environment in which the disappearance took place. That will help us understand the number one question that people always ask me when they know that I'm into MH370, the thing they always ask is why? What was the motive? Why was this plane taken? That's a difficult question to answer no matter what your favorite theory about the disappearance might be. Frankly, it's not something that is easy to say. We need to think about it carefully. The default assumption, of course, has long been that the captain must have taken the plane. In the last 3 episodes, we saw how the 3 pillars underlying that main theory turned out to be much more fragile than most people realize. And the implication that the captain wasn't the culprit leaves us with only one plausible alternative explanation, that the hijacking was carried out by an extremely ruthless and sophisticated outside actor, namely Russia. Okay. Why would Russia want to do such a thing? This is where Sean Wiswesser's expertise comes in. He has studied their motives. He has studied their mindset and their methodologies. He has gone toe-to-toe with Putin's Russia for decades. Let's hear what he has to say. Sean Wiswesser, thank you for coming on the show. You have a new book out. It's entitled Tradecraft, Tactics, and Dirty Tricks, Russian Intelligence and Putin's Secret War. Congratulations.
Yep. Thank you. Yep. Honored to be with you, Jeff. Thanks for agreeing to talk about my book.
Absolutely. I've read it. I really enjoyed it. It's a thing. It really says something to read a book beginning to end these days, honestly. I really enjoyed it. You distill down some of the lessons that you learned as a senior operations officer in the CIA, where you worked in covert operations. You were both running Russian assets, namely our assets in Russia, and countering Russian attempts to run agents against the U.S. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, very well said, Jeff. Done a lot of podcasts, and that's about as succinctly as I've heard anybody state it. Yes, worked in Russian operations, both handling our assets, and that's correct terminology. Our assets, our agents. They of course call themselves operations officers or разведчики in Russian. We call ourselves officers, but I was handling assets or agents that were helping us, and then I was working with joint partners throughout my career, countering their efforts to recruit Americans and our allies. So, well said. Thank you.
Okay, great. I don't know to what extent. I'm just going to ask you questions. If you can't answer them, I understand you have like constraints being an intelligence guy. What are some of the places that you worked where you were stationed?
So constraints reminds me, CIA always wants me to say a disclaimer. So my views are mine alone, don't represent the views of CIA nor any other government agency. They asked me to always state that as it is stated in the book. So I can say broadly, CIA doesn't like us to comment on specific countries. Started my career as a foreign service officer, did some postings with the State Department, then entered my intelligence career. The bulk of my career of almost 28 years was with CIA. I served 12 years overseas, tours in Central and Eastern Europe, Eurasia, a lot of work in the former Soviet Union, and that's what they like me to leave it at, just regions. So.
Okay, and and then what year did you retire?
2023. Yep, end of 2023.
Okay, so you're fresh out of the service. So I think what you have to say is
still relatively.
Okay. Okay. So your book subtitle refers to Putin's Secret War. I was hoping you could tell us, what is this war? Yep. What are its objectives? Is it a continuation of the Cold War between the West and the Soviets?
Yeah, I think it is a continuation of the Cold War. I was very fortunate. Our former DDO, Michael Sulik, one of the most respected deputy directors of operations, and certainly in my career in CIA, maybe ever for us. Mr. Sulik mentions in the foreword to the book that he graciously wrote, we fellow Cold Warriors, meaning his generation and mine, we knew the Cold War didn't end. And we also knew that when Vladimir Putin came to power in Russia, former KGB officer himself, former head of the FSB, we knew who he was. Like the saying in sports, they talk about sports teams, they were who we thought we were. Well, Putin is who we thought he was. He's a Chekist. He's a believer in the mentality of the Chekistov, which I'm sure you read in the book, Jeff. Thank you for reading it. I spent time early in the book talking about that mentality, that culture of Czechism, dating back to the Cheka, the first security committee in the USSR. So the book is about how they've been leading this undeclared war on us, the West, and we haven't been paying attention. One anecdote that I shared is that a Russian intelligence officer I mentioned, I was debriefing, in the years after 9/11, and I never state exactly where, when, or how I want to protect our assets that helped us. But as a younger officer back then, decades ago, I was asking him, so why are you still calling us the GP in Russian, Главный противник, the main adversary? I thought it's about the global war on terror. I was trying to understand. I don't understand why Russia would focus on us with so much energy and resources. You're still focusing us on the main enemy. And this is, again, many, many years ago. And that was an education for me, because this Russian intelligence officer said, hey, Были есть будете. You were the main enemy right after World War II. That's what they called the Germans, by the way. They called the Germans Главный противник. The United States became the main enemy. You were always the main enemy through the Cold War. You are the main enemy today. And he was very adamant with you. That's never changed, and it won't. For us, the United States comes number one. And so I realized, because of officers like that working with me, and then the many examples over the past decades, they just will never stop focusing on us as the main adversary. And they focus the vast bulk of their resources against targeting the United States. So that's the undeclared war, Jeff. That's the war that we're not noticing, not paying attention to. Declared war by them against us, their intelligence services against us, and there are many examples.
You also wrote that Putin is engaged in a secret war. In this particular context, you were talking about Europe. You wrote Putin is engaged in a secret war, whether Europe chose to recognize it or not. Why would, in this context, Europe? But I think it's true more broadly. Why does the West? And I think it's true. Maybe you would disagree that the media and the government, meaning both the opposition and the party in power, don't recognize, don't acknowledge, never talk about hardly the idea that this war is being waged on a kind of
so Jeff, a big part of it,
level.
of course, is 9/11 and the necessary and important war on terror. I served in conflict zones like my entire generation of CIA officers. We all did. And so we were in an existential struggle with Al Qaeda and with terrorist organizations, we and our European allies. We can talk about whether other wars were necessary or not. I tried not to get into policy in my book. Other experts have talked about that. But I do believe that we had no choice to go into Afghanistan and to take on Al Qaeda. But that led to 20 years of war. I don't think the United States, none of us saw that happening. 20 years of nonstop war. And so we in Europe, our allies, were engaged in things that mattered. But we did take our eye off of Russia and China both. I firmly believe, and many of my generation of CIA officers, who a lot are now retired as well, like me, we look back and we say, yeah, you know what? We took our eyes off of our two main adversaries that have never stopped working against us, Russia and China. In the case of Europe, I believe firmly in the alliance, so NATO, and with our European partners, we have to work together. Jeff, the largest chapter in the book is on Ukraine war, and the Russian intelligence services, how they did it, how they promulgated it, their false prognostications of success. And I believe very strongly, as I stated in the book, that we have to support Ukraine. But I think that, there's enough mistakes sort of both in Europe and in the United States, looking back on 20 or 30 years of policy with Russia, that we weren't focused enough on the threat.
But it seems that even after the threat became clear, and I mean, things have really heated up in Russia. I mean, sorry, in Western Europe, especially the Baltics, but also Germany. I mean, I think the Germans are much more attuned to what's happening. But there's still, I mean, well, let me move on to this question. I want to talk about Gerasimov. Now, in 2013, a Russian general named Valery Gerasimov, he gave a speech that was very influential. And one of the things he talked about was this concept. In Russian, it's called gibridnaya voina, hybrid warfare. Uh-huh. And this idea of something called the Gerasimov doctrine became very contentious. Uh-huh. But I think the point is pretty incontestable. Russia was about to embark at that time on a really widespread series of unconventional attacks against the West, cutting undersea cables and pipelines, random acts of arson and sabotage. More recently, they attempted to place incendiary devices on air cargo freighters, all kinds of widespread and sophisticated computer hacking attacks, interfering with elections. I mean, the list really goes on and on and on. If you pointed to any of them in isolation, you would say, what's the motivation for this attack? Why put incendiary devices on cargo planes? It doesn't seem to serve any particular purpose. And people might tend to think, well, if there's no motivation, then that they probably didn't do it. But when you take these seemingly random acts together, a pattern starts to emerge. Do you see a pattern?
Yeah, of course. So spent a lot of time in the book, as you know. Chapter 8 is on sabotage and special operations, and then tying in again with chapter 10, talking about hybrid war and its development. So you said quite rightly, Jeff, they do use the term hybridnaya vojna, but of course that's a cognate from English. I prefer the term in Russia. They say bezkontaktnaya vojna, non-contact warfare, or they also called it vojna novого поколения, wars of the next generation, the new generation. So as I discuss in the book, and I've also been published in 2 other books, I've had chapters on these topics on hybrid war. I look at the Russian writings and the Russian doctrine. How do they articulate it? Gerasimov, as chief of the general staff, you're quite right. He gave a famous talk in 2013, and then he had a article from the talk that was in a military courier magazine, I believe it was called. for the Russian military. But what Gerasimov was articulating, and what that writer, you mentioned one writer called it the Gerasimov doctrine. He later said he regretted using that term because in Russian nobody refers to it that way. They refer to it as бесконтактная война, non-contact warfare, or they call it warfare of the next generation or new generation warfare. They're hearkening back to a debate going back 30 years, Jeff. It's kind of like often happens. We in the United States, we in Europe, we're way behind the curve. The Russians have been talking about this for 30 years. And what it first came out of was when the Russian army, after the Soviet Union collapsed, was in decline, and they watched what the United States pulled off with air power in the Gulf War in 1991. The Soviet, then Russian generals, they weren't stupid. They realized that this new revolution in military affairs, or the reconnaissance strike complex, it's called in military doctrine, meant that the United States was destroying armies entirely from the air. We took out Saddam's army entirely from the air. So for the Russians, they realized, you know what? We're in big trouble. Our plans that we could take Germany through the Fulda Gap in a conventional war, the United States might have enough and the best air power in the world with its NATO allies that they could destroy our entire army before we'd ever get through the Fulda Gap. And they knew, too, they were suffering from not keeping up funding and maintenance and tactics, techniques, procedures, TTPs as they're called. So, Jeff, that's an important doctrinal basis of writers that, like I quote in the book, writers like Makhmut Gareev and Slivchenko. These are famous Russian generals before Gerasimov. They were talking about these concepts. What's it all boil down to? The important point is Gerasimov articulated in 2013 an idea of continual warfare against their adversaries, Russia's adversaries. He didn't name them, but he just said, you know what? In modern times, maybe what we need is continual warfare, especially accentuating what he called information means, what the Russians call active measures. So the idea was they're constantly going to have a second front undermining their adversaries so that if they do need to go to war, then their adversaries will be weakened. So they practiced this in Georgia in 2008. And then again, the big test, of course, was Ukraine in 2014, where to a large degree, their information means they stalled the West, they stalled Europe into wondering, wait a second, what is going on here? Who are these little green men showing up in uniforms in Crimea? Of course, they're Russian soldiers, but they had no markings on them. They were little green men, as they were called. So that's what Russian hybrid war, non-contact warfare is all about. It's compensating for their deficiencies in some of their military and their Air Force in particular, the Russian aerospace forces, by using their intelligence services, information attacks, hybrid war, cyber operations. That all falls under it.
Right. I mean, I think what's important to underline maybe is that unlike conventional war, where you might use every tool in your toolkit to what they say kinetically attack your opponent and degrade specific assets like blowing up tanks and things like this. This kind of warfare, it's sort of like a throw everything but the kitchen sink at your enemy in a way that, I mean, importantly, does not rise to the level of triggering a shooting war. So it's like constant low level annoyance and irritation, but it can be things that they could directly hurt your opponent by like cutting a communications cable or cutting a pipeline, but it might also be things that are just designed to sow confusion, annoyance, irritation. Am I accurate in thinking that?
Yes, absolutely, Jeff. So you listed, let me hit on a few things you've commented on. First of all, again, you mentioned the Baltic countries and the Germans. Kudos to them for recognizing the threat and what is happening. The German intelligence chief, it was earlier this year or end of 2025, intelligence chief in Germany stated on the record, I think it was in January, we are at a state of war right now. We're at a state of war, just shy of kinetic conflict with Russia. And he's correct. The Russians, the GRU, attempted to kill the CEO of Rheinmetall last year. The Germans have the GRU dead to right. They have all the evidence. They laid it out. There's been more cable cuts in the Baltic Sea in the past 2 years than anywhere else in the world. That doesn't happen by accident. But, Jeff, one of the challenges is that NATO as an alliance, we haven't called every single one of these actions for what it is. Like the German intelligence chief said finally on the record, hey, this is war. This is undeclared warfare by the Russian Federation against Europe. And so every one of these incidences that, as you said, Jeff, sometimes the various populaces in European countries want to sort of write it off and say, wait a second, is this war? No.
On page 181 of your book, You wrote, the Kremlin and the RIS viewed the primary threat to Russia as the so-called color revolutions that occurred in the former Soviet republics like Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Ukraine. Gerasimov's vision essentially sought to turn the West's perceived strategies, exemplified by the color revolutions, against it. The perceived strategies, again, this is what's referred to as the Gerasimov doctrine or hybrid warfare, this idea of using a wide spectrum of outright warfare techniques. It's a really interesting idea that Russia's ultimate goal is to achieve regime change, essentially, in the West.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah. So they don't, Jeff, they don't, the Chekist mentality of those services, they don't fundamentally understand democracies. They don't believe that Georgia got tired of living under too much corruption, under the yoke of, Soviet oppressors. They don't believe that the Georgian people or the Ukrainian people or the Kyrgyz people in Kyrgyzstan, those color revolutions, as they were called, the Russian intelligence services were absolutely convinced these have to be CIA and Western intelligence plots, because you can't have people choosing their governments democratically. You can't have leaders elected freely. That just doesn't make sense to them, and they'll never accept that. So that's what I mean about Gerasimov looked at the color revolutions and he says, you know what, we're going to use their means against them. Didn't understand fundamentally these are democratically elected governments. And by the way, let's look at the example of Ukraine, because the Russian picked leader, Yanukovych, was a complete fraud. This guy fled in disgrace, ran away like a coward to Russia after his corruption, the fact that Russia had literally paid him off as a leader. He fled. So when we talk about who's legitimate leaders or not, Yanukovych didn't stay to fight democratically for his country and to say, hey, I am the Democrat. He fled like a coward. So Gerasimov's idea, though, is that, we're going to use information means in a constant state of a second front against the West, because that's what Putin believed was happening in the former Soviet Union. The Baltic countries are right behind Ukraine in terms of his list of grievances. Putin calling the collapse of the Soviet Union the, quote, greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. He doesn't accept that these countries had a right to choose their own path forward. And Yeltsin, for all of his rights or wrongs, in Gorbachev, before him, they were fundamentally heroic leaders that said, you know what, rather than fighting and having a civil war, we're going to let these republics go independent and choose their fate and choose what they want to do. Putin doesn't accept that.
So would you say that there is a kind of civilizational struggle happening between rule of law, free market democracy on the one hand, and kind of corrupt oligarchic, Putin-style governance on the other hand?
Yeah, and I believe, I make the point in the book, I believe it's an existential threat, Jeff. The Russian intelligence services, and not only them, their autocratic Chinese allies as well. This is an existential threat to the United States, no different than the global war on terror that we fought for 20 years. And how and why do I say that? They're fighting an all or nothing game. They believe, again, that democracies, fundamentally, they cannot tolerate democracies. It's not in Putin or Xi Jinping's world vision. And if you look at studies by the Rand Corporation and others over the past decades, unfortunately, Jeff, democracy is under threat. Democracy, unfortunately, the concept of democracy, democratic rule in a lot of the developing world has been under the gun, has been under fire. And so Putin's vision for his people, I'm a Russia expert, so I'm going to stick to the things I know in Russia. Putin's vision, he's articulated to the Russian people is say, hey, give up your freedom. It's okay. Let me rule for you and my group of siloviki, strongmen. Telling term, by the way. When would the American people or any European power ever tolerate the cabinet of important national security ministers being called strongmen? Jeff, we would never stand for that. We'd be like, what? Strongmen? That's what they call themselves? But his idea falls in line with an historic concept the Russians call vozhd. It's the idea of a leader, kind of like a Khan, the German term would be Führer. Okay, I'm sorry, but that's about the closest concept. An all-encompassing leader. The Russian concept of a vozhd is we're going to give up our freedoms so that we can live in security. This guy's going to take care of us. That's fundamentally what Putin's appealing to, whether he uses the term vozhd or not. That's what he's appealing to, the autocracy, having an autocratic leader that decides everything for you. That's their vision. That's what Xi Jinping's doing in China, consolidating all power to himself. And so they can't tolerate functioning democracies on their borders, Jeff. That's what the struggle is all about. They can't have the Baltic countries who chose their own path and who have succeeded dramatically. Look at how far the Baltics have come in 30 years versus Belarus. Belarus is a disaster. I've been in Belarus many times. Got to travel there as a student. They haven't progressed much at all from 1990. The Baltics have tremendous progress. They're integrated into the EU, Europe, functioning democracies. Not perfect. Ukraine's not perfect either, but these are democracies. And they have economies that work, market economies that work. For Putin, that's a problem.
You mentioned that from the Russian intelligence services perspective, they spend 90% of their time thinking about the United States. The United States has the war on terror to think about. They have China to think about. They have the whole world to think about. And it seems almost like what we're talking about is a kind of a one-sided war. Like one war is aggressively attacking the other, and the other doesn't even realize that it's happening.
Absolutely. Jeff, I tried to state the same as clearly and succinctly in my book. I hope that came across, but you just said it very well. You know, for the United States, most of my career in the intelligence community, Jeff, and the CIA, we could talk about a top 10 list of national security concerns, and they're articulated in our national security strategies, the NSS. Comes out with every presidential administration. Just came out this year with President Trump's second administration. And you look at that list, you've got a list of, proliferation concerns. China's certainly been on the list, a rising China. Russia's been on the list at one point or another over the past 20 years plus. But where has Russia factored? I would argue, unfortunately, for me as a Russia expert, and for my colleagues and I, as Michael Sulik, our former DDO, said, it's Cold War veterans. He is a Cold War veteran. I coming into the service after the Cold War. We knew Russia never was off the map. They were always a national security threat. But if you looked at 2010, where was Russia? Jeff, they weren't even really on the list. They were barely top 10. We had global war on terror. We had Iraq. We had counterproliferation. We had concerns over Pakistan and what was happening with that. We know Pakistan and proliferation. And so while Russia has been keeping its focus, number one, on the United States, the GEPE, the main enemy, main adversary, while China's been resurgent in the past 20 years, now the Chinese Navy has more ships than we do, Jeff, unfortunately. Their Air Force, unfortunately, wants to rival the United States. I would argue they still can't because of the pride of the United States is our pilots. The pride of the United States is our airmen, our soldiers, our Navy have way more experience doing it right, and we understand campaigning. But the Chinese are they're all out. They're trying to build more fighters, better missiles that can go further. Chinese Navy's outpaced us in terms of ship production. So that's what they're out for. China and Russia, they're out for global domination. And the United States, what are we focused on? Jeff, we've got a lot of their concerns. Let's not to mention the current war with Iran right now. I just wrote a piece I hope to get published soon on the fact that we can't take our eyes off China and Russia because they may act opportunistically right now. That's what I believe is the greatest threat right now, opportunism by Russia and China, while unfortunately we're at war with Iran.
So in order to do your job better, you learned Russian, you became fluent in it. There was an interesting linguistic observation that you make in the book, which is that in Russian, konspiratsiya does not have the negative connotation that it does in English. It means something more like espionage, tradecraft. And it actually would be a compliment to some. So it's actually a compliment to say you have good konspiratsiya. Whereas in the English-speaking world, like to say that something is a conspiracy theory is basically to say that it's crazy, that it's not really happening, you're imagining things. We don't like to think of that there's conspiracies. And so we have two visions of society that are at war with each other, one of which takes pride in carrying out elaborate, nefarious conspiracies, and the other that refuses to believe that conspiracies exist.
Absolutely, Jeff. You're a very astute reader. I have to compliment you because you've hit on key themes that I was trying to bring across to readers. My book is meant to educate. It's apolitical, as you know. I don't mention any U.S. president. The entire book.
Okay.
Don't talk about politics. You just hit on the key point that I'm trying to make in the book. We have an entirely different mentality than the Russian security services and what they've pressed on the Russian people for decades now. Russians use the term pravila konspiratsiya to talk about the rules. That's their closest equivalent to rules of conspiracy is their closest equivalent to what we call tradecraft, where I title my book Tradecraft. And they take great pride in what they also call maskirovka. Maskirovka is what we would call denial and deception, Jeff. The idea that, we're going to dupe you into doing our will, the Russians are, and you won't even know it. And this comes into the term, I also talk about in chapter 6 of the book, the polezny durak, the useful idiot. The Russian concept back to the days of Lenin. Lenin said, hey, let's take advantage of idealistic idiots in the West that believe in the communist revolution and we'll take advantage of them for our purposes. This has always been a part of Russian intelligence culture. And it's why with their active measures, what they also call measures of support, they're supporting their malign policies. They're trying to get academics, journalists, diplomats, politicians in the West and in Europe to say, you know what? And there are some of them now. I'm not going to name which countries, but one of them has an election going on right now where there's politicians that say, hey, you know what? Russia can be our friend. You know, we don't need to worry about the threat from Russia. I don't know how in the world a country that suffered revolution, a revolution that was put down by the Soviets in the 50s, a leader of that country could possibly believe Russia is going to be a friend to them under Vladimir Putin. Blows my mind. But again, trying to stay apolitical, focused on them and their mentality. You hit the nail on the head, Jeff. You know, they just view the struggle entirely differently than the United States, you know. And the other thing that I'll mention is, you know, I watch a lot of Russian news. I try to keep my language sharp. We're headlining their news every single night. Jeff, every single night, United States is all over their news with a widely propagandized, bizarro version of the war in Ukraine, which is that the U.S. is there fighting them. Supposedly, according to the Russian version of the news, it's U.S. troops on the ground, NATO troops on the ground. Nothing further from the truth, the reality we know of. But that's their version of the war. They're fighting fascism in Ukraine, despite the fact that the Ukrainian president is Jewish himself. He had members of his family die in the Holocaust. So what's the news in the United States? We've got a lot else to focus on. We've got our economy. We've got the Iran war now. We've got the war on terror never abated. So, yeah, very different worldviews. And fundamentally, we can touch on this more if you like, but it's the Russian insecurity about the West, which goes back hundreds of years. You know, that's always been there.
I think it's really important. I think the gist of what you're trying to accomplish is not possible unless we engage in a somewhat delicate discourse about what is happening vis-a-vis Russia in the United States. And I'll let you kind of, you know, guide me in how you want to talk about this, because I know you don't want to be political, but at the same time, it is kind of front of mind. So I think it has been fairly well established. You have a chapter in your book about Russian interference in the 2016 election. This U.S. Senate found evidence of this as well. I think it's at this point not really debatable that Russia engaged in active measures to subvert the 2016 presidential election in the United States. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Listen, here's the fundamental point, Jeff. I believe with all of my experience, and those, by the way, of most colleagues that I've come across in the intelligence community that looked at this issue, let's look at what the DNI report said from 2016, the Director of National Intelligence Report and the Senate Select Committee report, which were both bipartisan. Current Secretary of State Rubio was part of that Senate report. He signed off on it too. What did it say? It said they meddled. It said they attempted to disrupt, disinform, misform, and sway the American public. But what was the fundamental mission? It wasn't for any one or other candidate. Jeff, that was incidental to what the Russians were doing. The Russians were trying to undermine the very concept of democracy. They were and they still are trying to get Americans not to trust our electoral system. It's back to what you and I just covered, talking about this is different views of civilization. It's about the Russian intelligence services saying, you know what, we can't have democracy. It's a mortal threat to this regime that they're trying to keep in power, Putin, and whoever follows him. And so the disunion, the infighting that they created in the United States, you know, how did they do that? We can get into the nitty-gritty if you like, but fundamental best proof I always point to is look at what those reports talk about. Look at what Facebook found in its own investigation about the, unfortunately, millions of likes that Russian trolls picked up on. Jeff, they were arguing different sides of the same issues. They were picking the most emotional issues they could for the American electorate, and they were arguing both sides just to amp up the level of emotion and amp up the level of hostility. And they continue to do that. And it's a lack of awareness among the American people I'm trying to change, that these guys are playing us for fools. The Russian intelligence services are making us fight one another. We should be focused on them. They're the mortal threat to our democracy.
Yeah. Well, Sean, I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to me and sharing your expertise. The book, again, is Tradecraft, Tactics and Dirty Tricks, Russian Intelligence and Putin's Secret War. I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in this topic. Sean, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Jeff. Important issues we talked about. I appreciate you gave it a deep read, I can tell, and I appreciate the chance to talk about the threat of Russian intelligence. Book's out on 21 April, so please consider a pre-order and go get it from your favorite bookstore. Jeff, thanks for having me.
Again, my deep gratitude to Sean Wiswesser for coming on the show. I think for a lot of us, the CIA is a shadowy and kind of unknowable organization that has almost mystical abilities. It's really refreshing to get a human perspective on what the world looks like from inside it. What I'd like to draw a line under in particular from what Sean told us is the idea that the concept of conspiracy looks very different in Russia and the West. Full disclosure, I have many times been described as a conspiracy theorist because I postulated that MH370 might have been hijacked by sophisticated actors. That kind of framing, namely calling me a conspiracy theorist, it's intended to denigrate and minimize a point of view. Because here in the West, we have a culture that treats the idea of conspiracy as inherently delusional and absurd. But as Sean points out, in Russia, conspiracy is viewed as a real thing, as in fact an important tool. And it's even a compliment to say that someone has good konspiratsia. So you can imagine if a culture that respects and admires conspiracy decides to use it as a tool against an adversary culture that sees, acknowledging conspiracy as a sign of mental weakness, well, you can just imagine the mayhem that might ensue. Or rather, you don't have to imagine it because we're living in the midst of it. And frankly, it isn't that pleasant. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.